A Duke for the Fair. Chapter 1. The Duke of Atherton had never been to a fair. This was not, he reflected, entirely by choice. His childhood had been spent in the solemn corridors of Atherton House, learning Latin and Greek, the proper way to address a bishop, and the precise angle at which to hold a wineglass at state dinners. There had been no maypoles, no penny stalls, no sticky fingers clutching gingerbread bought with coins earned from chasing errant chickens. Now, at 32, he stood at the edge of the Easter fair at Little Witchwood and felt utterly, profoundly lost. "Your Grace." The voice came from behind him, dripping with the particular brand of predatory sweetness that had become the bane of his existence. "What a delightful surprise to find you here. My daughter Penelope was just saying how much she adores the fair. Weren't you, Penelope?" Lady Penelope, a young woman of such insipid beauty that the Duke had difficulty remembering her face from one encounter to the next, curtsied with mechanical precision. "I do so adore the rustic charm of these country amusements." The Duke of Atherton, Alexander to his friends, had he possessed any, felt a muscle in his jaw begin to twitch. This was the 7th such coincidental meeting in a fortnight. Lady Mortimer, it seemed, had decided that her daughter would become the next Duchess of Atherton, and no amount of polite evasion would deter her. "Lady Mortimer," he said, his voice as cool as the North Sea, "I trust you will enjoy the fair. I have business to attend to." "Business?" Lady Mortimer's eyes narrowed. "At a fair, Your Grace." "Indeed." He inclined his head and walked away before she could formulate another question, leaving Lady Penelope staring after him with an expression of bewildered disappointment. He moved through the crowd with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to making way, though the fair-goers did not part for him so much as bounce off him, too absorbed in the delights of the stalls to notice the Duke in their midst. He was nearly to the far end of the green when a cry went up from the crowd. "Thief! Stop that girl!" A blur of blue skirts and dark curls came hurtling toward him, moving with the speed and agility of someone who had spent a lifetime dodging obstacles. The Duke had a single moment to register that the girl was heading directly for him before she collided with his chest, sending them both stumbling into a stall laden with pies. The pies did not survive. For a moment, there was silence. The Duke lay flat on his back, in a sea of shattered pastry. A woman sprawled across his chest, her hands planted on either side of his head, and her face inches from his own. She had remarkable eyes, he noticed, green as spring leaves and currently wide with a mixture of horror and fury. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a distinct French accent, "this is not how I intended to meet His Grace the Duke." "You know who I am." "Everyone knows who you are." She scrambled off him with considerably less grace than she had collided, extending a hand to help him up. "You are the man who has been standing at the edge of the fair for the past hour, looking like someone had just informed him that dancing is mandatory." The Duke ignored her hand, rising with as much dignity as a man covered in custard could muster. "And you are the woman who has just destroyed a stallholder's livelihood." "The stallholder," the woman said, brushing pastry from her skirts, "is my cousin Jean-Paul, and he will forgive me when I explain that I was being pursued by a man who believed I had stolen his watch, which I had not because I am not a thief. I am a pastry chef, and a pastry chef does not steal watches. She steals." She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing. "She steals nothing. I steal nothing. I am an honest woman." The Duke looked at her, at the flour dusted on her apron, the calluses on her fingers, the fierce pride in her green eyes, and made a decision that would change the course of his life. "You are precisely what I need," he said. Sylvie Dubois raised one eyebrow. "Monsieur le Duc, that is a very forward thing to say to a woman you have only just met, especially when you are both covered in pie." Chapter 2. The proposal he laid out for her in the relative privacy of Jean-Paul's pastry stall was, Sylvie decided, either the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard or the most brilliant. "Let me understand," she said. leaning against the counter while her cousin pretended not to listen from the back of the stall. You want me to pretend to be your fiancé for an entire week to discourage a matchmaking mother. Lady Mortimer is relentless, the Duke confirmed. She has attended every event I have graced for the past month. She has positioned her daughter at every turn. She has even gone so far as to arrange an accidental meeting at my club, which is, I assure you, not open to ladies under any circumstances. Sylvie bit her lip to keep from smiling. And you believe that producing a fiancé will deter her? I believe, the Duke said carefully, that Lady Mortimer will not pursue a man who is already engaged to someone else, no matter how unsuitable that someone might be. Unsuitable. Sylvie tasted the word. You mean common. You mean foreign. You mean a woman who works with her hands and smells of yeast. I mean, the Duke said, and for the first time something flickered in his cool grey eyes. A woman who is clearly not of my world. Lady Mortimer is a snob of the first order. She will not waste her daughter on a man who has publicly aligned himself with the lower orders. How very flattering. It is not meant to be flattering. It is meant to be honest. He leaned forward, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. I am not offering you romance, Mademoiselle Dubois. I am offering you a business arrangement. In exchange for your services as my decoy for the duration of the fair, I will provide the capital for you to establish a permanent pastry shop in London. A proper shop with a kitchen and a storefront and your name on the sign. Sylvie's heart stuttered. A permanent shop. For 5 years she had travelled from fair to fair, market to market, sleeping in carts and waking before dawn to knead dough in the cold. A permanent shop meant stability, safety, a future. What exactly, she said slowly, would this arrangement require? Public appearances, a convincing performance of affection. You will accompany me to the fair each day, attend the evening entertainments, and make Lady Mortimer believe that I am thoroughly besotted with you. He paused. And you will help me investigate a matter of some delicacy that requires knowledge of the fair's inner workings. Sylvie's eyes narrowed. What matter? The Duke reached into his coat and produced a small leather notebook, which he opened to reveal several pages of careful observations. There is a ring of card sharps operating at the fair. They have been fleecing the local gentry for weeks, and there is evidence that they are connected to a larger smuggling operation using the fair as a front for distribution. I have been tasked by a friend in the Home Office to gather information. A duke who spies on smugglers, Sylvie said, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. How very romantic. There is nothing romantic about it. He closed the notebook and met her eyes. Do we have an agreement, Mademoiselle Dubois? She thought of the shop she had dreamed of since she was a girl in Lyon, kneading dough beside her mother. She thought of the permanent kitchen, the steady customers, the life she had been chasing for so long. She thought of the way the Duke's eyes had softened, just for a moment, when he looked at her. We have an agreement, she said, and extended her hand. He took it. His palm was warm and calloused, not the soft hand she had expected from a man of his station, and she found herself holding on a moment longer than necessary. A pleasure doing business with you, Mademoiselle Dubois. Call me Sylvie, she said, and smiled. If we are to be engaged, you should at least use my Christian name. The Duke looked startled, as though no one had ever made such a request of him before. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a curve of the lips, but it transformed his stern features into something almost human. Sylvie, he said, and her name in his deep voice sounded like something precious. Then you must call me Alexander, at least when we are in company. Sylvie and Alexander, she repeated, testing the sound. It has a certain ring to it. From the back of the stall, Jean-Paul coughed loudly. The custards, he said in French, are burning. Chapter 3. The performance began that very evening at the fair's opening banquet. Sylvie had transformed herself with the help of a borrowed gown from Jean-Paul's wife, a pretty thing of rose silk that had been intended for a farmer's daughter's wedding, but served admirably for a pretend duchess. She had pinned her dark curls up in a style she had seen on the ladies in Bath, and she had scrubbed the flour from her fingernails until they were as pink and clean as a society missus. When Alexander came to collect her from Jean-Paul's cart, he stopped so abruptly that she thought he had encountered an obstacle. "You look—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "You look very fine." "I look like a pastry chef playing dress-up," Sylvie said frankly. "But I am the best pastry chef in England, so I shall simply have to rely on my charm to carry the day." "I do not doubt it," Alexander said, and offered his arm. She took it, and together they walked into the fair's great marquee where the gentry of 3 counties had gathered to dine and dance and watch the spectacle of the Duke of Atherton with a woman who was clearly not his equal. Lady Mortimer saw them first. Her face, when she registered the sight of the Duke with a strange woman on his arm, underwent a transformation that Sylvie would remember with pleasure for years. The predatory smile froze, then cracked, then rearranged itself into something that was not quite a smile at all. "Your Grace," she said, appearing at Alexander's elbow with the speed of a woman who had perfected the art of social ambush. "We were beginning to think you would not join us. And who is your companion?" Alexander's hand covered Sylvie's, where it rested on his arm. "Lady Mortimer, may I present my fiancée, Mademoiselle Sylvie Dubois?" The silence that followed was so profound that Sylvie could hear the crackle of the candles on the chandeliers. "Your fiancé," Lady Mortimer repeated. Her voice had lost its honeyed tone entirely. "My fiancé," Alexander confirmed. "We met at the fair. It was—" He turned to Sylvie, and something in his expression shifted. It was quite instantaneous. Sylvie, who had been bracing herself for a performance, found that she did not need to act at all. The way Alexander looked at her, as though she were the only person in the room, as though the entire world had narrowed to the space between them, made her heart beat in a way that had nothing to do with their arrangement. "Lady Mortimer," she said, dropping into a curtsy that was perhaps not as graceful as it might have been, but possessed a certain rustic charm. "I have heard so much about you. Alexander speaks of nothing but your kindness to him." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Lady Mortimer could not call her out without admitting that Alexander had never mentioned her at all. The older woman's lips pressed together into a thin line. "How delightful," she said. "How very unexpected." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and whispers and curious stares. Sylvie charmed the matrons with her accent and her enthusiasm for English fair traditions. She disarmed the gentlemen by asking intelligent questions about their estates and their crops, and she kept Alexander's hand in hers through all of it, anchoring herself to his solid presence as the social currents swirled around them. When the dancing began, he led her onto the floor without asking, his arm around her waist, his hand warm in hers. "You are doing remarkably well," he said quietly as they turned together. "I am a pastry chef," she replied. "I have faced worse crowds than this. At least these people do not throw rotten fruit when they disapprove." He laughed, a real laugh that drew stares from the couples around them. "Do they throw rotten fruit at pastry chefs?" "Only the very best ones," Sylvie said, and was rewarded with another laugh. They danced until her feet ached, until the candles burned low and the musicians packed away their instruments, until Lady Mortimer swept her daughter from the marquee with a face like thunder. And when Alexander walked Sylvie back to Jean-Paul's cart, they did not speak of the card sharps, or the smuggling ring, or the investigation that was supposed to be the point of all of this. They spoke of nothing at all, and it was the most natural thing in the world. Chapter 4. By the 3rd day of the fair, their arrangement had become something Sylvie was afraid to name. They played their parts for the crowds, the besotted duke and his charming commoner, strolling through the fairgrounds with their hands intertwined. She fed him pastries from her stall, laughing when a smear of jam ended up on his cravat. He bought her ribbons and trinkets from the stalls, watching her face light up with a satisfaction that she suspected was not entirely feigned. But in the quiet moments, in the stolen glances across the crowded marquee, in the warmth of his hand at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd, in the way he said her name when he thought no one was listening, something else was growing. She did not want to name it. She could not afford to name it. He was a duke, and she was a pastry chef, and their engagement was a fiction that would end with the fair. But when he found her in the kitchens late at night, helping her prepare the next day's pastries, she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone. "My mother was the finest pastry chef in Lyon," she said, rolling out dough with practiced ease while Alexander watched from a stool by the fire. "She taught me everything. When she died, I came to England because my aunt was here, and I thought I would find a place. And instead you found the fairs. I found freedom." She looked up from her work and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I found that I could make something beautiful with my hands, and people would pay me for it, and I would owe nothing to anyone. That is a kind of freedom that a duke cannot understand." Alexander was silent for a long moment. "You are wrong," he said finally. "I understand it better than you think." She stopped rolling, her hands still on the dough. "I have been the Duke of Atherton since I was 12 years old," he said, and his voice was different now, softer, more human. "I inherited a title, an estate, 100 obligations. I have never chosen anything for myself. Not my education, not my profession, not the people I associate with. Everything has been decided for me by men who died before I was born." He rose from the stool and came to stand beside her at the table. In the candlelight, his face was all shadows and angles, and she could see the boy he had been beneath the man he had become. "You chose me," she said quietly. "I chose a decoy," he corrected, "but I found—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I have found that I do not want the arrangement to end." Sylvie's hands were trembling. She set down the rolling pin and turned to face him fully. "Alexander!" "I know," he said. "I know it is impossible. You are common, and I am a duke, and the world will not allow us to be what I am beginning to wish we could be. But I cannot." He reached out, and his fingers brushed against her cheek, leaving a trail of flour on her skin. "I cannot pretend that I do not feel something when I am with you. I cannot pretend that I have not been happy for the first time in my life, here in this ridiculous fair, covered in your pastry flour and listening to you laugh." Sylvie's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You are not pretending," she whispered. "You are being honest. That is different." "Then let me be honest." He stepped closer, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body through the thin cotton of her dress. "I do not want a duchess who was chosen for me by matchmaking mothers and society expectations. I want you. I want your pastry and your laughter, and the way you look at me as though I am a man and not a title. I want—" She kissed him. It was not a proper kiss. It was flour and desperation, and the taste of the sugar she had been working with, and it was the most perfect thing she had ever experienced. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and she felt something in her chest crack open and spill out into the space between them. When they finally broke apart, he was smiling. That small, rare smile that she had come to treasure more than any of his ducal graces. "I was not finished being honest," he said. "Then continue," she said, her forehead against his chest. "But perhaps while we make the morning's brioche, the dough will not knead itself." He laughed, and the sound filled the tiny kitchen like light spilling into darkness, and Sylvie let herself believe, just for a moment, that the impossible might be possible after all. Chapter 5. The card sharps revealed themselves on the 5th night of the fair. Sylvie had been watching them for days, following Alexander's instructions, noting which men lingered too long at the gaming tables, which women smiled too brightly at the winners. She knew their faces, their habits, the way they moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of predators. What she had not expected was to find them in Jean-Paul's stall, threatening her cousin with a knife. "Ah," said the man who held the knife, a thin, sharp-faced fellow with a scar across his cheek. "The Duke's little pastry chef. How convenient." Sylvie's eyes met Jean-Paul's. He was pale but unharmed, his hands raised in surrender. "They know," he said in French. "They know about the investigation." "Let him go," Sylvie said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "He has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," said another man, emerging from the shadows. This one was older, heavier, with the look of a gentleman gone to seed. "He has everything to do with it. His stall is the perfect front for our operation. All those deliveries of flour and sugar, all those early morning arrivals. Who would suspect a pastry chef of running smuggled goods through the fair?" Sylvie's blood ran cold. "You have been using my cousin." "We have been using everyone." The scarred man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "But the Duke has been asking too many questions, and now you are going to help us make him stop." They told her their plan then, laying it out with the casual cruelty of men who had done this before. Alexander was to come alone to the fair's storage sheds at midnight, with no witnesses and no protection. He was to bring the evidence he had gathered against them. And if he failed to appear, or if he brought the authorities, Jean-Paul would pay the price. "You have until midnight," the scarred man said, and shoved Sylvie out of the stall and into the darkness of the fairground. She ran. She ran through the sleeping fair, past the silent stalls and the darkened tents, her lungs burning, her legs aching, until she reached the inn where Alexander was staying. She pounded on the door until a sleepy servant let her in, and then she was in his room, the words tumbling out of her in a flood of terror and fury. Alexander listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each word. When she finished, he rose from his chair and crossed to the wardrobe, where a pair of pistols lay in a velvet-lined case. "I will go," he said, "alone, as they instructed." "No." Sylvie caught his arm. "They will kill you. They will take the evidence and kill you. And then they will kill Jean-Paul anyway, because there will be no witnesses left." Alexander turned to face her, and she saw the same cold calculation in his eyes that she had seen the first day they met. "What would you have me do?" She thought of her mother, who had faced down a mob of angry customers with nothing but a rolling pin and the force of her will. She thought of the 5 years she had spent alone on the road, surviving on her wits and her courage. She thought of the man standing before her, who had chosen her when he could have chosen anyone, and who was prepared to die for her cousin. "Do not go alone," she said. "Go with the fair." Chapter 6. The fair at midnight was a ghost of itself. The stalls were shuttered, the lanterns extinguished, the great marquee empty. Only the storage sheds at the far end of the green showed any light, a faint yellow glow that flickered through the cracks in the wooden walls. Sylvie waited in the shadows with the men Alexander had summoned. The fair's wrestlers, its butchers, its stallholders who had been cheated by the card sharps and were eager for justice. Jean-Paul's wife had spread the word while Sylvie ran to the inn, and by the time Alexander emerged with his pistols, a small army had gathered. "They will kill him if we are not careful," Sylvie said, her voice barely a whisper. "They will not touch him," Alexander replied, and there was something in his voice that made her believe him. He walked toward the sheds alone, as they had instructed, his hands raised to show he carried nothing. Sylvie watched him go, her heart in her throat, and counted the steps until he reached the door. It opened. The scarred man stood in the doorway, and behind him she could see Jean-Paul, bound to a chair, his face bruised, but his eyes alive with defiance. "You came alone?" the scarred man asked. "As you requested." Alexander's voice was calm, unhurried. "I have the evidence. It is in my coat. You may have it when my cousin is released." "Your cousin?" The scarred man laughed. "The pastry chef is your cousin now. How convenient." "He is my fiancé's cousin," Alexander corrected, "which makes him family, and I protect my family." Sylvie heard the signal in his voice, a slight emphasis on the word protect, and gave the nod to the men behind her. They moved as one, a wave of bodies surging from the shadows, and Sylvie ran with them, her eyes fixed on Jean-Paul, her hands already reaching for the knife she had hidden in her skirts. The fight was short and brutal. The card sharps were gamblers, not fighters, and they were outnumbered 10-1. Within minutes, the scarred man was pinned to the ground, his knife skittering across the dirt, and the older gentleman was weeping apologies into the mud. Sylvie reached Jean-Paul and cut his bonds, pulling him into her arms as he collapsed against her. "You are safe," she said in French, over and over. "You are safe. You are safe." From somewhere behind her, she heard Alexander's voice, cool and commanding, directing the men to tie the prisoners and send for the magistrate. And then his hand was on her shoulder, warm and solid, and she looked up to find him standing over her, his face smudged with dirt and something that might have been blood. "It is over," he said. Sylvie looked at him. This man who had come to her world of flower and fairs and had fought for her cousin as though he were his own, and felt the last of her defences crumble. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I love you, and I know it is impossible, and I know we cannot, but I love you, Alexander." He knelt beside her, there in the dirt and the darkness, and took her face in his hands. "I love you too," he said, "and I do not care if it is impossible. I am the Duke of Atherton. I make the impossible possible. It is one of the few privileges of the title." She laughed, the sound breaking into something that might have been a sob. "You cannot marry a pastry chef. Watch me." Epilogue. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a sun-drenched morning in June, in the little church of Little Witchwood, where the Easter fair had changed everything. The congregation was divided neatly down the middle. On one side, the nobility of 3 counties, drawn by curiosity and the scandal of the season. On the other, the fair folk, the stall-holders and performers and travellers who had become Sylvie's family over 5 years on the road. Lady Mortimer was not present. She had, according to the gossip columns, retired to the country to nurse her wounded dignity and her daughter's broken heart. Jean-Paul stood as Sylvie's witness, his wife weeping with joy in the front pew. And when the rector pronounced them man and wife, Alexander took Sylvie's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made the society ladies sigh and the fair folk cheer. "You are a duchess now," he said against her lips. "I am a pastry chef," she corrected, "who happens to be married to a duke." "And what?" he asked, his eyes dancing with the warmth she had first seen in a pie stall. "Does a duchess who is also a pastry chef want for her wedding breakfast?" Sylvie smiled, and it was the smile she had been hiding her whole life, bright and warm and entirely her own. "Brioche," she said. "A great deal of brioche, and perhaps some of those little custards my cousin makes, and—" She reached up and touched his face, the way she had wanted to since the first day they met. "And you. Just you." He kissed her again, there in the church with the sunlight streaming through the windows and the congregation cheering around them, and Sylvie Dubois, now Sylvie Dubois, Duchess of Atherton, let herself have the thing she had never allowed herself to want. A home, a future, a love that had found her in the most unlikely place, wrapped in pastry dough and the promise of something new. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, Kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap